Hi everybody. Jak se máte? Good? How are you doing? Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here again in ReactiveConf and to talk to you about dynamic components in Angular. Just a few words about myself, very shortly, because the introduction was really great. I love Angular, and that's all I do most of the time. And NG girls. Let's start our presentation with a demo. So we're talking about dynamic components. Who is not familiar with this screen? Almost no hands. If you're not familiar with this screen, you probably don't use Angular, and you should start doing this. This is the screen, the main component that the Angular CLI gives us when it generates a project for us. So what is a dynamic component? Are there any dynamic components here? Not really, right? Nothing seems really dynamic. What about if I press here and get this color input? What do you say about that? Is this dynamic? Well, still not really. Let's see what else this component can do. If I click here, ooh, what do you say? Is this dynamic? Well, could be. It depends on the implementation. And if I click here, OK, so this must be a dynamic component, right? OK, so dynamic components are actually not something about the component themselves. It's about how they're used. So even a regular component can be dynamic. Let's look at a project that I have with real dynamic components. I have here two buttons, add quote and add graph. And I can dynamically decide what component I want to add. So for example, quote components or graph components. And these components are not hard-coded in my project. And we'll see how we do that. And these components are also linked to everything we have in Angular, dependency injection and change detection. So for example, let me just make it a little bit bigger. If, for example, I want to change the name of the person who said this sentence here, now it's me. So you can see it changes also here in the note. And if I want to change the values of the graph, so these components are also linked to the data of the whole application. So if I change it in one graph, then it should change also in the other one. So these components work with Angular, but they're loaded dynamically. So let's see what I mean about that. Okay. So let's talk first about static components. Static components are components that we know about them in runtime. We know about them in development time. We just use them in the template with the selector. Like here, we have lots of dynamic static components. We have the app header, which we don't really know here its contents. It's a different component written somewhere. We have the tab set and tab. These are components that come from Angular Bootstrap. And we have another component there, app dashboard, which is also static. We use them directly in the template. We can pass inputs and bind to events and so on. So when I'm developing this application, I know about these components. I know that I'm going to use them. I import their code into the module, and they're in a fixed location wherever I put them. So it's kind of hard-coded, which is fine if you use it once in a very specific location. This is the way that we're supposed to use most of our components. So let's say that you're developing a dashboard, right? Who hasn't been working on a dashboard? This is a very common use case with the web applications. So you have lots of different types of components, and your users decide what components they want to use. So you can provide them with tens or even hundreds of different components, and the API to use them to pass data and bind to events. And the user might select only 5 types of components, 10 types of components that they want to use, not all of them. And you also don't know in which order. So the user can select the same component a few different times, the same chart with different data. So if we're working with static components, then you might do something like this. You have your template, and you have all the different components there. You're iterating over this array of components, of configuration that the user has. And for each item on this array, you will check the item's type first, and then use ng-switch to show the component that you want, that matches this type. So here I have only, how many? 5 components? And it already looks really bad, right? Imagine that we really have hundreds of components. So this template will be really big, and there's no way to split the template because we need all these components. We already split it and destructure it by really creating specific components for each type. And we need to call them here in the template. Now, another thing that's not really great here is that we have to ship all the code of all these components to the user, even though the user will not use most of these components. Like I said, probably 5, 10, 20 types, and we have hundreds of them. So I want you to imagine, just imagine, if we could replace this whole code snippet, this whole template, with just one line. What do you say about that? Huh? Okay, so let's talk about dynamic components. And first, we'll talk about some, like what they are, and we'll show some use cases, where they're used, where you should use them. So dynamic components are added to the application, to the DOM in runtime. So you can load configuration from the server, for example. You can load the specific components that you want, this array of components. And you can even lazy load the components code. You don't need all the code on your application when it starts running. So most of the code, these hundreds of components, will not be shipped to the user. And like I said, there's only one line in the template. This is the placeholder where the dynamic components will be inserted. We get a reference to this place using the view child decorator. And we need then to resolve the component factory and create the component itself. So where can we use them? Like I mentioned, dashboard, classic usage for this. Data-driven forms. So you have maybe a form configuration, or you have a form that's built according to the data itself. So you check the type of data, if this is a date, if this is a text, if this is an email, and then you dynamically create the form for this data. Pop-ups and modals. So here we actually have 2 dynamic components used. One is the pop-up itself. Whenever we want to add this pop-up, it is supposed to be added to the body element, and not inside a specific component, not even inside the app component that we have. And we might need it from different places in the application, from different flows and use cases. So instead of hard coding it somewhere, we just have a method that creates this pop-up whenever and wherever we need it. And the other dynamic component we have here is the content of this modal, of this pop-up. So this is the component, the dialog component from material, Angular material. And that's exactly the way that they do this. They let you create a component and add it dynamically inside this dialog. Because you will need a different component each time. And again, there's nowhere you can hard code it inside this dialog that they give to you with their library. Content management systems, and a great example for that is the Angular documentation, Angular I/O. So they have a bunch of dynamic components that they just give content to, and the application actually can read the source code of Angular, and so all the code, all the classes, all the documentation that there is, if it's changed, the guys who write this documentation, they don't need to do anything because the application just gets the source code and builds the page, the documentation by itself with dynamic components. All the code snippets, and if we have code snippets with tabs, examples, links, everything is dynamically loaded. We can embed dynamic components into components from a different framework. So in this example, this is a real use case that I had. I was creating an application which is for drawing diagrams. And we were using their library called Joint.js. And it's written in Backbone. And most of the components there are in SVG. So you can create these boxes and links between them, and you can move them around. And they give you an option to embed an HTML component in the SVG. But if you want to embed a regular HTML component, that's really easy. But we want to create an Angular component and have it working with dependency injection and change detection and all the things that I mentioned from within this Backbone framework. So the way that you do that, you create dynamic components, and you also have to manage them with the lifecycle hooks and make sure that you have the ng destroy called whenever you remove the SVG box, and so on. So a really great article about that is by Yuri Strumpfoloner. And he wrote how to do this exactly. So if you have this use case, I really recommend this article. Another use case that we had is using plugin components. So let's say you're working with a team, and you're building the application, and other team members build some plugins that you can plug into this application. So in this example, this is an application that allows teachers to create worksheets for their students. And they can use different types of questions, like you see here, complete the text, or this problems with the screen resolution here, and select the right answer, and so on. So the teachers want to use more and more different types of questions, but you don't know what each teacher is going to use. And you can create, you or other developers can create more types of questions for them. So when you're writing the application, you don't know what kind of questions they're going to be. You can't state them specifically in your application. But there's a way, if you're using dynamic components, that you can load from the server the current list of plugins that are available, and then the user can choose whatever they want. And again, they don't need the code of all the different components that you have. They need only what they use. A great article about that, and also a video that you can watch, is by Maxim Koretsky. Modules are not what you think they are. So make sure you watch this and read his blog posts in Angular in depth. So if we're using regular components, our components are declared in our modules, our Angular modules. And then Angular looks at your templates and knows where the component is instantiated. It creates a component factory, and then it just creates the instance of the component with the component view, which includes the DOM node that it's sitting on, and the instance itself, the instance of the class with all the information and logic. And then it is just rendered where you use it in the, on the DOM. But if you want to use a dynamic component, you need to add it on top of the declarations, also in entry components. And this way, Angular knows that this component is probably not used anywhere in the template, but it needs to create a component factory for it. And also, it creates a host factory to create a host component. The host will link the component to the DOM node where it's going to be inserted eventually, dynamically. So that's why we need to specify it in the entry components as well in the ng module. The main app component that we have is actually also an entry component, but because we state that it is a bootstrapped component in our Angular module, then it is already also considered as an entry component. Okay. Now, you can actually check the components that are created or the instances of the classes that are created by Angular. Let's get this a little bit bigger. In our dev tools, okay. Yeah, you can see this, great. If you go to no, sorry, not the application. Sources. Okay, you go to sources, and you have all the scripts that are loaded, and also everything that is created. So here under ng, you can see all the modules that are created, and let's pick one of them. So, for example, app module. You can see the ng factories that are created, and for let's take a look here. Wait a minute. Okay, home module. You can see that for our static components, only an ng factory is created, and you can take a look at it and see its content, but it might change according to the Angular version and the compiler, so don't really take a specific example of what's written in this code. It's generated by Angular. But you can see that for regular components, there's only an ng factory. And for dynamic components that we have in entry components, we also have a host factory. okay? So that you can check the surrounding DOM element with. Okay. So how do we create dynamic components? Like I said, we have a placeholder in our template, and this is one way to achieve this. We hold the view child, and then this is the place where we'll insert the component. Now, to insert it, we first need to resolve the component factory to get it. Angular gives us the factory according to the component type, class that we pass to it. And then we need the injector that we have in the component that we're attaching it to. And with the injector, this is the way that we bind it to dependency injection. With the injector, we create an instance and insert it on this element. Now, this is actually the long version, which is, like you see, not very long at all. You can actually even minimize it to just, well, two lines of code. So you still need to resolve the component factory, and the view child always has a method already, create component, that attaches it to the injector, and voila, you have your component generated there. Now, we can bind inputs and outputs to the dynamic components because we just have the instance of the component ref, of the component itself, and we have everything on the instance. So we can just go directly, and whatever is public on this component, we can change the data or bind to it if it's events. But because it's not passed in with regular inputs and outputs in the template, then the lifecycle hook ng on changes will not detect changes when the value changes. So be sure to use ng do check if you do want to respond to changes in the data. Now, you can even do more things with the component, like pass inner components to it, projection, using content projection with the with another parameter when you create the component. But what we have here is still not really dynamic. Why is that? Because we need to know the type of the component ahead of time, during development time in this case. This means that we need to import the code to this file, and we don't need that, we don't want that. This means that the code of the node component will be included in the bundle, even though the user might not need the node component. So let's talk about dynamic component or plugin components, like we mentioned before. These components are probably unknown in compile time, and we can lazy load them. Now, we can't lazy load a component, we can lazy load a whole module. So you build a module for this component. And then you have to resolve the module. We have the loader that comes with Angular that can lazy load a module by giving it a string. So you don't need to know the class, the type of the module itself. You don't need to import its code. So it's just a string. So that's great. This is the same way that it's done with the router in lazy loaded routes. Then once you have the module, you create the injector and ask for the component resolver to get the factory, and you can create the component that you have in this module. Now, when you're building this with the Angular CLI, you have this option, lazy modules, And this will create different bundles and will not load them with the main bundle when you're building your project. So this is the way that you do this. When you're using routes and lazy loaded routes, you don't need to do that because the router does that by itself. But when you want to build the lazy loaded modules by yourself and control them, then this is the way you will configure the Angular CLI, and it will send its instructions to Webpack to build it in the right way. Here it is. Okay, but still, we have a bit of a problem here. We still use the component class itself to resolve the factory. So again, we need the code of this component here. But there's a great way that we can fix it. And this is what Maxim Koretsky mentions in his talks and his blog post. And this is the ng module that's wrapping our dynamic component. And we can use the providers to register this component on the provider. So we just need to know the name of the provider. Here it's just a string, but you should use, of course, an opaque token for this. And the string is supposed to be known in the application. And we're using multi-true because we can load different components on the same provider. So it will be an array of components instead of just one value. So make sure to write multi-true over there. And then, instead of fetching the component itself, we get the widget provider using the injector, and just access it and get the component that we have there without knowing its class. So what do you say? Do we have dynamic plugin components now? Did we succeed in this, in our mission of lazy loading the components and dynamically adding them to the DOM? I think we succeeded, right? All right. So here are the resources that I used. There's another one that I have to mention by Manfred Steyer. He also shows another way to dynamically load components. This is his demo project. So there's a regular static component and a lazy loaded component, but he also creates components and wraps them as Angular elements. So actually creates web components and then loads them using a script tag that is attached dynamically to the application. The script tag loads the script of this now web component and attaches the newly created component that we have there. So you should check out this way also of using dynamic components. And perhaps this will be a better way for you to use this, especially if you have different teams using different frameworks to create your components. Another person that I need to thank is Igor Minar, who's going to be a speaker here. He's giving a talk in about an hour. He's from the Angular team, and he also helped me understand what's going on with the components when they're dynamically loaded and what threats there are. So make sure that you know what's going on in this code, that you trust the code of the dynamic components, because if you let some other developer that you don't trust to ship code into your application, it might be misused. So of course, all the security threats and everything, you need to consider those. So if you have any questions, I'll be here later with the Q&A session. And you can also reach me in the mail, Twitter, and so on. And if you'd like to support NG Girls, we have a newly created Patreon page, and your contribution will be very, very very welcome, and we'll be very grateful for this. I hope you enjoyed and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.